if you like the music, it's the two people there called the piano boys. And you can ask them on YouTube, there's so many music. Beautiful music. You know that only two Gospels narrate the Christmas story, or what is called the infancy narrative. Only two. Matthew and Luke. Mark does not have a Christmas story, and John does not have a Christmas story. But although they have two Gospels that focus on the infancy of Jesus, they are completely different. Luke focuses on Mary. Matthew focuses on Joseph. And if you read those two stories, you get the impression that two babies were born, because they're completely different from each other. The two stories are completely different from each other. Even the mood, the Gospel of Luke is very full of joy. Everybody's singing. But in the Gospel of Matthew, it's very gloomy. There's the killing, the murdering, and all those things. So that's just so completely different. That's why it's not always good to mix the two stories together. But in most plays or movies, Matthew and Luke are mixed together. That's why people get confused. People get confused. So when you present, when your time comes to present a talk, make sure that you make that clarification. You're focusing on Luke or you're focusing on Matthew, because they're just so different from each other. Now, these are the biblical and other biblical characters that I'd like to focus on. The highlighted one in color, that's my focus this morning. I have done Jesus already 2 years ago, so I don't want to repeat that, although you were not there in my talk. Okay? And hopefully, eventually, in the next year or so, I will focus on the shepherds and the Magi. And Father Ross was telling me into something on what you call this, on the other biblical characters like what you call this, Simeon and Anna, but maybe some other time. Okay, let's start with Mary. Mary, what can we learn from Mary as an Advent character? What can we learn? This is what we can learn from her. She is a woman who pays attention. And that basically is the meaning of being contemplative. Paying attention. Paying attention. If you read the Gospel of Luke, as I told you, Luke focuses on Mary. These are some of the adjectives used in that story. She is troubled when the angel appeared to her. And then she pondered on the words of the angel. And then again, Luke says she was afraid. She was puzzled. And yet, despite all these disturbing emotions in Mary, she remained trustful. It's very hard to remain trustful when you are troubled. I'm sure you have experiences of being troubled, of struggling with certain issues in your life. It's very hard to remain trustful. And yet, Mary remained trustful. So that's one thing that we can learn from her. The other one is, Mary sees the whole. Did you notice in the story of the wedding at Cana, she was the only one who noticed that there was no more wine. Everybody's busy in the party, but she was the only one who noticed there's no more wine. And that's why she brought this to Jesus' attention. So she sees the whole. That's very important, to see the whole. Despite being immersed in the activities, she remained also an overseer. It's something like a basketball game. You always need a coach who oversees. The players are involved in the activities, but they don't have the picture of the whole. They don't see because they're so involved with the court. The coach is supposed to see the whole. So that's the role of the coach. Why is the post necessary? Because he's the one who sees the whole. Honestly, that's the meaning of being a bishop. It's the meaning of being a bishop. The word that we are familiar with is episkopoi. Episkopoi. What is the meaning of episkopoi? It means overseer. One who sees the whole picture. And who is the one involved? For example, in the social action, because remember, that's the original work of the bishop is to oversee. But somebody has to be involved. It's the diaconal, the deacon. You're supposed to know how many widows are there in the diocese, how many orphans are there, how many are homeless. The deacon is supposed to know that and bring that to the attention of the bishop. You know, in the early church, as you know in your study of theology, the deacon was more powerful than the priest because eventually the development changed and the whole thing changed. Okay? So that's the first thing that we can say about Mary is she sees the whole, involved yet can oversee. That she was truly Jewish. Many times we forget this, that Mary, Jesus, Joseph are all Jews. But all Jews. In what way can we say that Mary is a real Jew? Because she listened, and in listening, she obeyed. Do you know the word we say conception? She conceived and bore a son. The word conceive is the same as concept and conception. They come from the same. You conceive in the womb, or you conceive a concept. You have a concept of a house. You have a concept of a priest. You have a concept of whatever. Your concept there in your head. Mary listened and conceived the word that she listened, and the word became flesh. So she conceived the word. She listened so attentively that the word became flesh. What is amazing is that the Torah is said to contain 613 laws. That is controversial because some rabbis say there are 635. But anyway, whether it's 613 or 635, what is amazing is in all those laws, the word obey does not exist. Can you imagine? Usually, when you talk about laws, you mean obey, right? Obey the law. But the word does not exist. In the 630 or 635 law, the word obey does not exist. You know why? It is this. You know, would you believe that the Hebrew language is a very poor language? The Hebrew biblical language only contains 8,000 words. Believe it or not, Hebrew biblical language, talking about biblical language, only has 8,000 words. You compare that to English. English has 400,000 words. Hebrew has 8,000 words. But its poverty is its richness. Why? Because every word in Hebrew has many meanings. One word can mean many things. Many things. It's like an overstuffed luggage. An overstuffed luggage. You open it and it explodes. You look at Hebrew and it has an explosion of meaning. For example, the word obey does not exist. So they look for what could possibly be the translation of obey in Hebrew. And they found a word that could appropriate the word obey. And it is Shema. Shema. Okay? Shema. So listen. Okay? Now in ancient Greece, knowing was a form of seeing in ancient Greece. In Hebrew, knowing is listening. You see the difference? One is sight, one is hearing. In Greek, and remember, this is important because we are very much Greek influenced because of the Western culture. we are not very much Jewish understanding. So in Greece, knowledge is through sight. In Hebrew, it is through listening. So Judaism is a non-visual culture. Jews worship God that cannot be seen. That's why making images and icons is prohibited. They don't have like us. We have statues with pictures. That's against the Jews because they worship God who cannot be seen. In Judaism, we do not see God. We hear God. In Judaism, we do not see God. We hear God. And that's why in Genesis, Adam and Eve heard God's voice in the garden. And what is perplexing is when they heard God's voice, they hid themselves. It says, hid themselves from God among the trees of the garden. That is strange. How can you hide from a voice? You hide from not being seen. That's why, you cannot hide from a voice. Hiding means trying not to be seen. How can you hide from a voice? The Jewish God is through listening. In Judaism, listening is a deeply spiritual act. To listen to God is to be open to God. And that's why the closest word that they can use for the word obey is Shema. It is untranslatable in English. It means so many things. Remember I told you 8,000 words, but one word can mean many things. So Shema can mean approximately to hear, to listen, to pay attention, to understand, to internalize, to respond, to obey. It appears no less than 92 times in the book of Deuteronomy, more than any other book of the Torah. I mean, the book of Deuteronomy, all about the law. So time and again, in the last month of his life, Moses told the people, Shema, listen, heed, pay attention, hear what I'm saying, hear what God is saying, listen to what He wants from us if you would only obey and listen. Judaism is a religion of listening. This is one of the most original contributions to civilization. So Mary listened to the word, to the voice, and conceived the word. Conceived the word. Now you can appreciate John chapter 1, the very opening lines of John's Gospel. In the beginning was the one who is called Word. The Word was with God. He was truly God. From the very beginning, the Word was with God. And with this Word, God created all things. Nothing was made without the Word. Everything was created, received its life from Him, and His life gave light to everyone. The light keeps shining in the dark, and darkness has never put it out. So now you can understand why Jesus is called Word. It's God that Mary listened to and became flesh. It's not. So you can see that for the first time, the image of God is revealed in the face of Jesus Christ. This is the first image of God. And yet, the very image of God that reveals hides. That's the paradox, right? If you studied philosophy, okay, you see, we are what you call this, and flesh spirit. But the flesh should reveal the spirit, but the flesh hides the spirit. Isn't it? So I could be looking at Yush. Oh, that's Yush. He's a nice person. But he could be hiding himself. He could be hiding himself. He could be a very cruel person, but I don't know. I only see the outward. But inside, what is it? So while the physical makeup of Lush makes me know him, he also uses it to hide himself. So the Word is the first image of God, the revelation of God that reveals and hides. Because people were scandalized. Is this God? How can that be God? That's why the Jews until now cannot accept Jesus Christ as Messiah. They cannot accept Jesus as the image of God. How can God be crucified or died or things like that? They cannot accept it. And this idea of Mary as a contemplative person is the very thing that she passed on to Jesus. Remember the words of Jesus. When you read the words of Jesus, you always say, did she get that from his parents? I always ask myself, where did he get this attitude? Where did Jesus get this disposition? Who is he like that? Most likely because of Mary and Joseph. He was born by them. For example, on the issue of prayer, being contemplative. Remember the words of Jesus kept saying, but when you pray, go into your room, close the door, pray to your Father, be seen, or lock the door. The issue there was, remember at one point, the disciples of Jesus were asking him, teach us to pray, just as John taught his disciples to pray. Why? I mentioned this before to you during your tweet day, that every rabbi has a particular prayer that he teaches to his disciples, so that when people hear these people praying, this group of men praying, oh, that's the disciple of Rabbi Akiva. Oh, that's the disciple of Rabbi Hillel. Why? Because of their prayer. Their prayer tells you the rabbi they are following. So John also taught his disciples a particular prayer. But how come Jesus is not teaching his disciples how to pray? They always see Jesus praying, but he never taught them how to pray. And so they ask, teach us how to pray, so that people will know that we are your disciples. But these are some of the words that he said about prayer. When you pray, go into your room, close the door, and pray to your Father. And when you pray, do not keep on bubbling like pagans. That's a beautiful phrase, bubbling. And sometimes I could translate this, do not heap up empty phrases. Do not use vague repetitions. Do not use meaningless repetitions. Do not be verbose. Don't ramble, speak not much. You see, Catholics are like this. We have so many prayers. I say Mass in our parish here. And we pray to Padre Pio. It's a very long prayer after monthly Mass. So I couldn't stand it anymore. So I told the sisters, do you know that when we are praying the prayer to Padre Pio is done before we finish the prayer. We couldn't stand anymore the long prayer, So they must have told the parish priest, so the parish priest shortened the prayer. But we do have, it's okay for young people like you to have many prayers to be verbal. But as you grow older, you should be less wordy. Spend more time in silence. Because silence is the language of God. And we must learn that kind of prayer. When my mother, before she died, she had Alzheimer's. And the last stage of Alzheimer's is simply inability to speak, is silence. And I always say, why does that happen? Maybe because even the language is forgotten. But I said, people with Alzheimer's really are teaching us that the last language we have to learn is silence, which is very difficult. It's the most difficult language to learn. More difficult than Japanese or Chinese. That when Francis Xavier went to Japan, he says, when he left, he says, Japanese language, and I suppose Chinese is more difficult. It's the language of the devil. Why Estrella, he couldn't learn it. He was so frustrated he couldn't learn Chinese. So he said, it's a language of the devil, So, anyway. Jesus is speaking non-verbal prayer. He was teaching his disciples a prayer without words. But the disciples just couldn't get it. Paul, in his letter to the Romans, beautiful words that Paul said, the Spirit groaning within us, finding words for what we cannot find. That gives us confidence. I think I told some of you, at Mass, the liturgy of the hours is boring. Really boring prayer. But it's called the liturgy of the church, prayer of the church. And you just have to persevere in praying, even when you're alone. You know why? I really believe it's a skeleton. It's a skeleton. There are times when you cannot find words to pray. And because you have been praying the liturgy of the hours for so long, through your years, you have memorized some phrases. You have memorized some stanzas. And you can use them, your favorite stanzas, favorite phrases from the Psalms. And you can simply use that and repeat it and repeat it and repeat those phrases. And that's a bit. So I always say the Psalms, love God with all your heart, with all your mind, with all your soul, and your whole strength. In other words, be present. Be present. When the heart is present, when the whole self is present, that is prayer. But you know how difficult it is to be present. We cannot access God. We cannot access the Holy until our whole self is here, until the whole of us is present. Because contemplation is being present to the present before the presence. And this is what the Buddhists have taught us, Christians. That's why they have a form of yoga. Yoga is a discipline. To be able to pray, especially in contemplation, you must be able to discipline your body. You must be able to discipline your body, to be present. And that's what the breathing exercise that we learned from the Buddhists is a form of making yourself present. Not living in the past or in the future. Eckhart Tolle said in his book, The Power of the Now, that the human mind can only do two things. It can only do two things. What? Endlessly reprocessing the past, or endlessly worrying about the future. Our mind is always in the past, reprocessing the past, or thinking about the future. But to live in the present is so difficult. The human mind cannot be present in the now. And you can only be contemplative if you are present. That's when Thomas Merton, when he asked a Buddhist monk, when he attended a conference in Thailand, how do you train your students to become contemplative? And the Buddhist monk says, if you cannot close the door quietly, you cannot be a contemplative. What does that mean? When you are not present in the present, in other words, mindless, you're not thinking of what you're doing. Just watch yourself the way you stir your coffee. If you make noise, that means you are mindless. You're not present. You're thinking of something else. That's why you create noise. So, watch yourselves. When you create noise, it's because you are not present. You're not present. Okay. So the natural disposition of Mary, this is another thing that she passed on to Jesus. When confronted with difficulties, Luke says twice in the Gospel, Mary kept all these things to herself, holding them deep within herself. The first time that is mentioned in Luke is when the shepherds went to visit the grave. And the shepherds were telling Mary, an angel appeared to us and told us to come here. The Messiah is born. And Mary understand what they were talking about. But Luke says, she kept them in her heart and pondered. The second time was when Jesus got lost. And why did you do this to us? Mary said, why did your father and I were worried to death? What were you looking for? You should know that I am in my father's house. And Mary did not understand. But she kept it in her heart and pondered. But you can, I'm sure, in many other instances, for example, Simeon told her, a sword will pierce your heart. During the presentation. I'm sure Mary did not understand, but she kept it in her heart. Or when Mary is looking at Jesus on the cross and wondering, why did this happen? I'm sure she kept it in her heart. And I know that she passed this to Jesus because on the cross, instead of cursing the Romans there and all these people who caused his crucifixion, he said something else. Father, forgive them. When you are able to contain the tension in your heart, when it comes out, it's not anger or bitterness or resentment, but it is forgiveness. And that's why, in Tagalog or in English, we say, when you are so angry, count 1 to 10. To slow down the emotion, slow down. Because if you don't, and it comes out immediately, then it's going to be hurting words, and you cannot take it back. My father used to say when we were kids, he said, when you have a disagreement with your friend, a quarrel with your friend, don't say anything, any word that you will be embarrassed about when you reconcile. It's very important. Don't say anything. So that is keeping the tension in your heart, pondering, and when it comes out, it is calm and forgiveness. So those are the things I'd like to talk about. Joseph, the story of Joseph. We only find this in the Gospel of Matthew. In the Gospel of Matthew, the focus is Joseph. Mary is hardly mentioned. In the Gospel of Luke, it's Mary. Mary is the focus, and Joseph is hardly mentioned. So, now in the Gospel of Matthew, very little is said about Joseph. But there's one word that is so important in describing Joseph. What is that? He did the right thing. He is righteous. That's the word that Matthew uses to describe. He is a righteous man. But what is the meaning of righteous? To do the right thing. When you do the right thing, you are righteous. You do the right thing. So in Matthew's story of Joseph, you have this situation, a dilemma. Joseph was in a dilemma. What's the dilemma? He was betrothed to Mary. No, betrothal is not engagement. Betrothal is practically being married to a woman. But you don't live at least for 1 year. You don't live together for 1 year. What is that? To protect the dignity of the man. Why? Because you get married, you're not living together for 1 year, but then the woman gets pregnant. So somebody got ahead of you. Right? So that's exactly what happened. Somebody got ahead of Joseph. So how can you marry this woman who had a relationship with another man? So that's the purpose of betrothal. So Mary and Joseph were betrothed. But practically they're married. In other words, if Joseph dies, Mary becomes a widow. If Mary dies, then Joseph becomes a widower. But they don't live together. That's betrothal. So that's exactly what happened. So Joseph finds out that Mary is pregnant. But they're not living together. So now, instead of the case should be, Mary should be brought to the Jewish court and she would be stoned to death. But Joseph decided otherwise. The angel appeared to him. That's a form of discernment. That's basically he discerned. And what is the result of the discernment? to follow the law of God rather than the law of man. That's the righteousness of Joseph. He did not follow the law of man, but followed the law of God. The law of man is stone her to death. The law of God is life must be preserved at all costs, because only God can take somebody's life. So Joseph followed the law of God, respect for life. And so he decided to part with her quietly. That makes Joseph righteous. And that's what makes him holy, because holiness is basically defined as the quality of our decisions. The quality of our decisions. Why is that, this is so important? Especially, I think that's why St. Ignatius, his spiritual exercises, leads us to this. How do we make good decisions? In your ministry later in your life, you will be handling people. People will be under you. And you will make certain decisions. And before you make any decision, you have to ask yourselves, how will this affect the people? What will be the effect of my decision to these people? What is the quality of your decision? Whatever decision you make. Because the will of God, what is the will of God? The will of God is to become the best person you can be, not in comparison with anybody. Not in comparison. And you do that through good decisions. And that's why during retreats, you have to think back, what are the decisions I've made in my life? What made me sad, what made me frustrated or bitter? And what decisions did I make that caused me happiness and contentment? So, you know why you have to ask that? Because our decisions have a pattern. It is a pattern. And you must detect the pattern of your decision making. So I'm dealing with a woman who is beginning her third relationship. And she invited me to have lunch with the possible third relationship. So the three of us were sitting there. And so she told me her story. She was married before to a Filipino, and then the marriage did not last long. They parted ways, but they are not yet divorced. The marriage is not annulled. She left for Canada, and she's now in a relationship with a Pakistani, a very rich man. And now after 11 years of being together, she met this guy, Filipino, and wants to have a relationship with him and separate with a guy in Canada. And I said, why? Oh, he's boring. What? For that reason, I'm going to separate from him. 11 years of marriage. They are not married yet. Boring. What does that mean? Boring. I think this woman is after sex-citing, not exciting, but sex-citing. So I kept quiet. And I said, you know what? You have to start looking at the way you make decisions. Your first marriage failed, your second relationship is about to fail, and you're starting a new relationship. That will fail. Look at the way you make decisions. Because you are making a decision that is life-changing and will affect so many people, not just you. So, how do we make decisions? Very important. So that's what it means for Joseph to be righteous. He made the right decision. How about John the Baptist? John the Baptist. A life of social justice. Look at this text that we read from Luke. The crowds asked John, what should we do? John told them, if you have 2 coats, give one to someone who doesn't have any. If you have food, share it with someone else. When tax collectors came to be baptized, they asked John, Teacher, what should we do? John told them, don't make people pay more than they owe. Some soldiers asked him, and what about us? What do we have to do? John told them, don't Don't force people to pay money to make you leave the road. Be satisfied with your pay. That's still happening today. In the Christian scripture, when we talk about social justice, 1 out of every 10 lines deals directly with the physically poor. 1 in every 10 lines. And the call from God for us to respond to them. Can you imagine? 1 in every 10 lines of the Christian scripture. In the Gospel of Luke, that becomes every 6th line. The Gospel of Luke. Every 6th line deals with the poor. In the Epistle of James, the commission is there in one form or another every 5th line. In the Hebrew scripture, they thought that the quality of faith in the people depends upon the character of justice in the land. The quality of faith of the people depends upon the character of justice in the land. And the character of justice in the land is to be judged by how we treat the most vulnerable group in the society, namely the widows, the orphans, the strangers, and look without aliens. Where we stand with God depends not just upon prayer and sincerity of heart, but also on where we stand with the poor. Jesus identifies his own presence with the poor. He tells us that ultimately we will be judged on how we treat the poor. Bluntly put, we will go to heaven or hell on the basis of giving or not giving food, water, clothing, shelter, and justice to the poor. You remember the parable of the sheep and the goat in chapter 25 of Matthew. You remember that story? So the sheep and the goat. And God said, the sheep you can enter. I can enter the kingdom of heaven. Why? Because I was hungry and you gave me food. I was thirsty and you gave me water. I was naked and you clothed me. Enter. And then the goats, get out of my sight. I was hungry and you did not eat me. I was thirsty, you did not drink. I was naked and you did not clothe me. I was in prison and you did not come to visit me. Get out of my sight. That is a telling story because it basically says we will be judged on our noticing and not noticing. Noticing and not noticing. Whom do we ignore? Whom do we notice? Or fail to notice? Remember, this is what's so unique about Jesus. He identifies with it. Love God is loving your neighbor. Not love God because, but love God is loving your neighbor. Loving God is loving your neighbor, and your loving your neighbor is loving God. And loving your neighbor, another way to read this again in Hebrew. Love God with all your heart, with all your mind, with all your soul, with all your spirit, and love your neighbor as yourself. But the other translation, which I think is really good, is love your neighbor because he is just like you. I think I mentioned that in one of my homeworks to you. Okay, let me just conclude this now. I have to start this. Oh, no. There's something else here. This is interesting data. According to one study, if the entire world's population were reduced to a village of 100 people, this is what life in that village would look like. 57 inhabitants would be Asian. Out of 100, 57 would be Asian. And 21 Europeans. And 8 Africans. Interesting, isn't it? Huh? 14 from the Western Hemisphere, 70 would be people of color, 30 Caucasians. In terms of religion, out of 100, 30 would be Christians, and 70 out of 100 would be non-Christian. In terms of wealth distribution, half of all the wealth would be in the hands of 6 people. 6 out of 100. 6 would be holding the wealth. And all 6 would live in the United States. Isn't that amazing? But that has changed because China has come in. In the developing world, 630 million tons of food lost due to harvesting, storage, and transportation. 630 million tons of food. I remember going to one of our missions in Culacan because I had to leave a talk there. And along the way, this young priest, I can't remember his name now, met me at the airport and brought me to Culacan, the mountains. And along the road, I saw these pumpkins, calabasa, just there on the road. I said, what's this? There's no farm to market road. So the people just throw what they harvested on the road. Because it's so expensive to bring them to the market because there is no road. So 630 million tons of food lost due to harvesting, storage, and transportation. How about in the developing world? In the underdeveloped world, 630. In the developed world, 670 more. Millions of due to bad consumer habits. My own nephew, when I was in the States, he always opens the refrigerator and take everything out and throw it. It's already expired. In the Philippines, we don't throw food whether it's expired or not. It's still good. But he just throw all this food. This is American habit. 670 million pounds of food simply lost to bad consumer habit. And then we have now, I'm almost there. I always tell people that on Christmas Day, not Christmas Eve, Christmas Day Mass, the reading is from John. It is this. He came to his own people, but they did not want him. But whoever did want him, who believed he was who he claimed to be, and would do what he said, he made to be their true son, their child of God's stars. He's already pointing to Good Friday. On the very day of Christmas, we're already being told of Good Friday. They did not want him, and so they killed him. So Christmas points to Good Friday. Let's have a prayer. Together. Lord, teach me to be more prepared, humble, expectant than I have been in the past, ever ready to encounter you in quiet and small ways, never appeal to my compassion, every act of unselfish love, you shows up and humbles my perfect love, and I recognize you still walking through the world. Give me the grace of simplicity, which alone can receive your mystery. Come and abide with me, feed me, walk with me, enlighten my mind, and let me come. Enter my humble life with its poverty and limitations, as you enter the stable of Bethlehem, the workshop of Nazareth, the cottage of Emmaus, blessed and consecrated to real and small and ordinary life.
Please don't forget to like and subscribe
to our YouTube channel,
Oblate TV.